Okay, thank you so much. So good day, good morning, where everyone is at in their different spaces today. Thank you so much for attending my presentation today. Today, I will specifically be talking about understanding feminism through the lens of our African foremothers. So, as I understand that that might be quite a mouthful for all of us, but I thought as soon as I saw the call for abstracts that was sent out by the League of African Women in Philosophy, this would be a great opportunity as our African foremothers, as I have noted in literature and in society as a whole, are people that are standing still in time, even though time is going forward, right? Especially because the theme of today's talk is the past, present, and future, whereas our African foremothers, as I have seen in gerontological studies, are often neglected. So before I go on to present my work today, I just want to give out a few disclaimers. So I'll be regularly using or interchangeably using the words elderly, older women, and old. And the reason why I'm giving this disclaimer is because for those of us that come from the philosophy of gerontology, we know that there are certain names that are considered discriminatory and very harmful to the elderly population. However, I am using these words in order to show a sense of respect for the people that I will be talking about, specifically because I'm talking about elderly people in the African context. And so my use of words such as elderly, older women, and old are used in a context that is respectful, as to say. My second disclaimer for today is that usually when I present work on the African context, there's always a reminder that Africa is a continent and not a village. And so while I will be trying to encapsulate the realities of Africa, of elderly African women, I am also cognizant of the fact that there are multiple contexts, multiplicity of cultural contexts that apply in Africa. And so today's work, I specifically want to focus on the context of Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and Western Africa. But a great emphasis will specifically be placed on the Sub-Saharan Africa, mainly because a lot of my research focuses on those areas and also my own existential, um, I guess, experience is much more located in that area. Sorry, let me just do this. And so just to give a background of what my thinking was surrounding this topic or this paper that I've kind of started last year and have left it to hang. This paper or ideas are coming from my dissertation in which I considered how elderly African women have been neglected in the space of ecofeminism. And so, in my thinking surrounding this topic, or just specifically considering elderly African women, what was quite illuminating to me was that there's this heightened sense of invisibility that we normally see with elderly African women in the various disciplines, but particularly in the environmental sector, um, specifically in environmental philosophy. However, we also see that on the other hand, there's also this hyper visibility when it comes to the elderly population, but specifically when we consider elderly African women, we see that there's a great amount of responsibility that is placed on these women as they are often considered as inherent custodians of of knowledge and of knowledge. And so we see that there's this inconsistency that is prevalent in the invisibility and hypervisibility of elderly African women. And so, ooh, asked you to start. Oh, sorry about that. I hope you can see me. And so, as I've mentioned, my focus in my dissertation was coming from the philosophical standpoint, specifically the conceptualization of ecofeminism or lack thereof of indigenous voices or specifically elderly African women in this space. And from here onwards is where I developed a theory um, named African eco-materialism, which I will not go into great detail of that because that is not the scope of today's presentation. However, while I was considering these women in the environmental space, what was also quite clear and very prevalent is that there are other injustices that elderly African women are facing on a daily basis, which is part of the existential realities that are not necessarily accommodated for or necessarily spoken about in literature, or they are underexplored. And so because my thinking was grounded in this feminist way of looking at things, I noted that one of the things that is missing is elderly African women and how their actions, whether that is coming from the pre-colonial or post-colonial time, can be considered as feminism. Um, And so the key question of today's presentation then is guided by this question, which will ask us what constitutes as a critical African feminist gerontology. And as you see here, I tried to break it down into at least I would say three sectors or perspectives where we have the critical theory or Africana critical thinking, as well as the African feminism, but also gerontology. And so the scope of today, if we think of Africana critical theory or critical theory on its own, we know that this theory is one theory that considers the descriptive, normative, and praxis of a certain theory. And so in order to consider the descriptive of elderly African women, I will be looking at how elderly African women's experiences have changed over time from the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial times, specifically considering their experiences of oppression, subjugation, and marginalization. I will then further give a normative account of what I have found in terms of critiquing the identified gap when it comes to a critical feminist gerontological perspective. And from here, that's where I try to propose what I call a critical African feminist gerontology. And the third, which is the praxis of it all, is to give a position or the tenets of what we would consider as part of a critical African feminist gerontology. And that's about the same thing. So starting with the historicization of elderly African women, we know that if we consider the elderly women in the pre-colonial time, we see that elderly women were people who were considered as part of a group that were council women, and they also enacted obedience over time. Literature also reads as follows that old women acquired elderly privileges, such as the right to cut their hair short, wear their clothes in a male fashion, drink liquor, and pour libations. However, what was also interesting for me was that literature also shows us that elderly African women during the pre-colonial time also exercised a power over young women in the household. And the reason why I say that this was particularly fascinating is because when we think of elderly African women, especially in the traditional societies, we know that a lot of the time this is what we see when it comes to elderly African women with regards to when, as soon as they reach maturity or seniority, there's this sense of exercise of power that they have over young women, but only particularly young women. What also is interesting to see is that they were venerated in society. And while they are to a great extent marginalized and invisible in today's society, we can see here in literature that older women on reaching menopause took on political and religious role, which were restricted to men. And so this already tells you that eldership in the African context, especially the traditional societies, venerated seniority. Now, moving on to the colonial period, we see that there was a sense of moral and physical disequilibrium, specifically coming from the colonizers. And this is where we kind of start seeing a shift in society where elderly women go from that venerated position to this, to shifting in more into this marginalized position that they find themselves currently in. And this is specifically because there was a lot of physical strength that were needed in order to fight off colonizers. And so there was a shift in appreciation of the type of people in society. We see that during the colonial period, because the colonizers privileged Western patriarchal ways of knowing and being, there was a great loss of maternal knowing and ways of being. And so Western patriarchy came to the forefront by force. And so while our great professor, Ipadiola speaks about the existential epistemology of Black women being the other of the other, we can see that elderly women disappear in the background and become the other of the other of the other. And I go on to show that during the colonial period, there was difficulty in identifying the oppressors, which I will explain much more in detail later. And elderly women were not just at the background, but they consistently fought and resisted in their own ways. And our great feminist writer, Professor Oyemi, shows us this in by stating that elderly women maintained religious and spiritual teachings and would continue to spread African spirituality. And so our professor then goes on to show us that eldership was still venerated, but obviously had its own power disparities, especially during the colonial period. And so this notion of eldership on its own is not necessarily a neutral term, but often masculinized on its own. And so what do we currently see in the post-colonial settings? We see that because of globalization, colonialism, apartheid, and so forth, all these historical and cultural factors, we see that there's both contemporary and traditional societies that are grounded in the African context. And what this then does is that there's this sort of dual tension that is received, that the elderly African women receive. What do I mean by that? When we consider people with contemporary perspectives, we see that a lot of the time eldership is not venerated as it is in traditional societies. So, whereas in traditional societies, eldership, especially elderly African women, are placed at a certain higher level in the societal hierarchy, usually in the micro societal levels. We do not necessarily see that from people who hold contemporary perspectives. And so there's this Oh, okay. And so there's this constant vacillation of veneration and defaming that elderly African women kind of struggle to navigate in their existence. And as I've noted earlier on with our professor Ipadile, the elderly African woman then becomes the other of the other of the other. And so what is interesting to also see is that elderly African women put to the forefront what we would call as othering, other mothering, right? And while this concept is often explored by African feminists and womanists in the global north, specifically in America, this concept of other mothering should be at the forefront when we're trying to understand elderly African women in the African context, because as we know, mothering in the African context is not just a sense of biological consideration, but happens in a different way in which Western perspectives tend to understand mothering. And so this concept of mothering as well is often seen in matricentrism, which I deem as important if we're going to consider a new framework of critical African feminist gerontology. And so elderly African women are not just in this position of victimhood, but what we see as well is that they are also fundamental perpetrators of patriarchy and subjugation of younger women, usually in their homestead. And so going on to my second one, which is critiquing gerontology and feminism, we see that it is important to use both ideas and perspectives in understanding these women, specifically because gerontology is a perspective that helps us understand aging, older adulthood, and general aging related issues. It also considers the intersectionality of the elderly, which is an important facet, especially because we know that whether it is religious, economic, political, there are certain disadvantages that they experience in those different sectors that eventually affect their eldership. And so gerontology is also not necessarily an issue of gender, but in most authors, they also tend to privilege older women over men. Also integrate, I've also integrated feminism, but of course grounded in African thinking, and trying to investigate how these women specifically experience subjugation, oppression, and marginalization. And in some branches of feminism, we know that there's some form of intersectionality that is considered. However, we see that many gerontologists, they make use of feminism in their perspective, in their writings, especially those who consider elderly women as people at the forefront. And so the influence of critical feminist gerontology proposes both tenets of critical theory and feminism. However, the discipline of gerontology alone has proven to be inadequate, especially when we are trying to consider elderly African women. And so elderly African women's experiences are often excluded from the various conceptualization of feminist work and critical feminist gerontology. And for those of us that do work in the gerontological space or even feminism, we often see that many of the work are grounded in women in America and their experiences when it comes to gerontology in feminism. And so aging and the lives of older people often point toward white elderly females and various global north contexts. And so there's generally a lack of exploration of African women, as I've pointed out. And in light of today's theme or the conference theme, there are various African women in philosophy who have alluded to a further investigation in African women and feminism or slash womanism if we consider Professor Ugu Nyemi. And so the first one speaks about the issue of seniority and motherhood. Our feminist Oyemi speaks about the issue of seniority and motherhood. And as I've already explained in the beginning, that this idea of eldership is not it's not a neutral term on its own, but it's often masculinized, comes from the work of Professor Oyemi. The idea of motherhood, as well as we've seen from many African feminists, we see that the idea of motherhood is often casted in a negative light. And so, if motherhood is casted in a negative light, then subsequently, grandmotherhood is often then associated with that in feminism, sorry, reigning from Western perspectives. But what I deem as important here is that there is a lack of literature when it comes to grandmotherhood in African feminism. And so Dr. Msimbe Ita Edet also speaks about the case of Her Story, which is a movement for justice that aims to create a discernible balance and equity between the voices of women which are truly marginal. And as we see, whether it is reigning from the Western perspective or even African philosophical perspective, elderly African women are largely neglected and marginalized. And as I've noted here with Professor Ugunyemi, the neglect of eldership in African feminism and older women, there needs to be a consideration of what she considers as internalized patriarchy and oppression of younger women. And I think as well from many of the scholars that I've considered, I think this was a highlighting factor for me. And so what I am aiming to do with this theory is consider how I can bring together gerontology and feminism. And as we currently see it at the standpoint, we have what is considered a critical feminist gerontology, or some just call it feminist gerontology. However, this perspective alone is not adequate and sufficient to consider elderly African women's existential realities. And so, due to that, I encompass all three of these principles and tenets and try to understand how one can then recognize an African critical feminist gerontology. And so, why is there a further need for critical African feminist gerontology? If we consider even the sociologist Babalwa Magokwana, who is situated in the southern context, she speaks about recognizing umakhulu. Umakhulu is when I translate that into English, is the senior woman, senior mother. Sometimes people will use grandmother in order to associate umakhulu. And she says that umakhulu should be recognized as an institution of knowledge. And while I agree with Dr. Babalwa Magokwana, I agree with this because I've recognized how the elderly African woman's image is often associated with being poor, fragile, vulnerable, and in some instances, just a person who is oppressed. But what we can note that they are often also the oppressor. And so Magokwana encourages us to challenges humanity to rethink the nature and perception of African elderly women. And also see in African philosophy, which I think Dr. Lindokuhle Gama mentioned yesterday, is that even in sage philosophy, there is generally a dismissive nature of women sages. And if we want more evidence on this, consider the case of Perezinju Mutoni, who was one of the female sage philosopher who was interviewed. However, as the lone female sage philosopher, she was not, the way in which the interviewing went about was not the same as the male sage philosophers, which tells you a lot about how African elderly or African women are generally viewed. And so my proposal of what the tenets or some of the factors that should be included when we are trying to understand or when we are conceptualizing the critical African feminist gerontology is first we need to consider the intergenerational oppression and marginalization, internal patriarchy, the idea or the notion of invisibility and hypervisibility, and also power and empowerment. And so first, with the first tenet, we need to understand these when we are considering this group, that there's a quadruple oppression, which is that of age, race, gender, and class. And so while there are multiple axes of oppression because of the multiplicity of threats given the historical stance, there isn't a theory that can consider these women if it does not consider these historical quadruple oppression and even present quadruple oppression that currently is showing. With the second tenant, when it comes to internal patriarchy, it would not be of good faith if we do not consider how there's a lack of acknowledgement of recognizing who is the oppressor from the perspective of elderly African women. And one of the reasons that I put forward to this is because marginalization and subjugation for them has been reigning in different places. And another thing is that there has been centuries of oppression and marginalization that poses an existential threat. And so what I term or what I draw on from internal patriarchy, which I deem as important to understand when we are conceptualizing CAFG, is that if we consider the theory of Fanon with internalized inferiority, this is the same with elderly African women in that once they assume this stance or this position of eldership, there's also this recognition, whether it is in the psyche, is that there's been years, centuries of oppression, and also even for them, as they live as women, there's certain oppressive factors that they have to deal with. And whereas eldership should, well, at least in the traditional societies, whereas eldership should be this position where they assume a sense of power, there's this internal struggle as well with recognizing that they are elders and should be venerated, but at the same time, they're not necessarily given the same, I guess, for lack of a better word, power position with the elderly counterparts being men. And so they form this sense of internal patriarchy, and the way in which they express this, the way in which internal patriarchy is then expressed is through the oppression and marginalization of younger women. There's also this sense of invisibility and hypervisibility, which I spoke about, which I'll not go furthermore into detail given time. But when we consider how as well. There's this invincibility in the spheres of economic, political, and so forth, but hypervisibility in the micro-societal level as an elder, even though this sense of eldership is not on a neutral level as the countership. And so while I spoke about this vacillation that they experience from the contemporary and traditional perspectives of people, there is this constant vacillation of invincibility and hyper visibility. And so one one of the last tenets which I propose is also important to consider is this notion of power and empowerment. While the ideas of power and empowerment are usually well conceptualized in African feminism and womanism, I do see a need to further consider these notions when we're specifically considering elderly African women, as while there are some spaces in which they might experience power and try to empower younger women, we also have to note that they are the same people that try to almost take away their power. And so to conclude today's presentation, I try to give a descriptive overview, her story of elderly African women by considering their positioning and giving a normative account in considering the missing gap when it comes to the critical feminist gerontology position and giving the practice of the four tenets of the critical African feminist gerontology. Thank you.